Hi ho folks, how's everybody doing? Welcome to the review session. Sorry I'm running a minute late. I was fixing myself a cup of afternoon coffee. How's everybody doing? Who we got in the chat bar today? Who we got in the chat bar? Check in and say hello for our afternoon review session. Miriam Hurani. Good morning, Miriam. We don't usually see you in the morning lectures. I'm glad to have you here. Thanks for showing up today. Oh, you're Allah. Okay, excuse me. I do see Allah. And we got Melissa here. Hi, Melissa. Good to see you. Happy afternoon. I got my my little chef's outfit on here. I was preparing some hamburgers for tonight's dinner. One of the things that I have to do to stay here, or I don't have to do, but one of the things I do is I buy groceries and cook for my friend John while I'm here. You'll see I don't have my normal background today. I am actually up in the bedroom. He does a little bit of live streaming too for other things, and he's got his mess down in the kitchen area, so I am upstairs in the bedroom. Hope everybody's doing well. Oh, I see you're on your sister's YouTube today. Okay, cool. Well, that's good to see you anyhow. I'm glad you can make it. Hopefully the sound is coming through. Hopefully the video is coming through. I'm surprised we only have a couple of people here today. That is a shame. I am so bummed out. But at least I have you two, Miriam and Melissa. Hi, Melissa. So are you ready for the exam today? I hope so. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and get started. So let me go ahead and switch to the whiteboard. Tell you a little bit about the exam that's coming up this weekend. It's 49 questions long. They're going to be 13 questions on Chapter 9, 12 questions on Chapter 10, 12 questions on Chapter 11, and 12 questions on Chapter 12 for a total of 49 questions. You'll see we have 3 short answer questions, and I've got big dots showing you where the short answer questions are going to be. So I've got one question on motivation and emotion, specifically the motivation part of the chapter. And I've got 2 questions on stress and coping. Stress and coping for this exam. Okay. Good enough? Everybody got that? Any questions about the format of the exam? As usual, you'll have 60 minutes to finish the exam. The other questions will be a mix of multiple choice, matching. We've got one ordering question, and probably somewhere around 6 true false questions. Okay, can you see that well enough? I'm sorry about my handwriting. It is an absolute mess. So that's sort of the structure of the exam. 49 questions, 13 on 9, 12 on 10, 12 on 11, 12 on 12. 3 short answer questions, 1 on Chapter 9, 2 on Chapter 11. Then we're going to have a mix of multiple choice. We'll have several matching questions. I think somewhere around 3 matching questions, 1 ordering questions, and 6 true or false questions. Okay? Let's go ahead and be done with that. Okay. Hi, Jasmine. Good to see you. Thanks. Glad to see you could make it today. No, I don't wish. So, great. I'm glad to see that you are here today live. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. If there are no questions, I'm going to switch back to my whiteboard. And I'm going to, you can't see it, but I'm sitting here looking at the exam right now. So Chapter 9, if you'll remember, that is all about motivation and emotion. If you remember, the first part of the Chapter 9 is about motivation. So we talk about theories of motivation, what agency means. And then we go over the theories of motivation. And then the other half of the chapter is about emotions. Okay? Oh, no problem, Noelia. I'm glad you could make it. So we've got 3 or 4 people here, which is good. The rest of them will watch it recorded. So one of the things I want you to know, what is agency? Okay, so chapter 9. What is agency? I'm definitely going to want you to know that. Now, let's see. 1, 2, let's see. Let's see. Questions on, okay, so if you remember, we had those general theories of motivation. If you remember, we talked about drive reduction, we talked about needs-based theories, we talked about optimal arousal. So I've got several questions. I think it's 3 questions about just general qualities of those questions. So what are the properties of motivation? If you'll remember, we talked about the properties of motivation. Remember, I think I asked you, motivation is activating, motivation is directing, motivation is sustaining, and motivations differ in strength, if you'll remember that. So I want you to know the properties of motivations. Oh, and I want you to know intrinsic versus extrinsic theories. So, if you would, which of the theories are intrinsic theories of motivation and which of the theories are extrinsic motivation? Actually, the more proper question to ask, which of the theories would be based on extrinsic theories of motivation? Do you folks remember that? Optimal arousal, needs-based, drive reduction, or incentives. Which of those 4 theories would be extrinsic and which of those 4 theories would be intrinsic? So I want you to know that. So the general theories of motivation, the properties of motivation, and which of those theories are intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Does that make sense? Somebody type in the chat bar and let me know if that makes sense. Okay. Okay, and then I have two questions on temperature maintenance. Remember, we talked about temperature maintenance as being a drive reduction theory. So I've got 2 questions on that. Okay. One question on. Okay, so there's a question on. Let's see. Optimal arousal and personality. There's a question about that. Okay, and then Maslow's theory of motivation. Arrange from base to top. All right, I want you to know which of those motivations comes first, which of those motivations comes last. And then there's a matching the needs with the psychoanalysts. Remember, we talked about Freud, Karen Horney, Alfred Adler, and Charles Murray, and I suggested to you each of those psychologists suggested a different need was important. Exactly, Maslow. Exactly, Jasmine. Maslow's was the pyramid, and I want you to know how those needs are arranged. Which one's first, which one's second, which one's third, which one's fourth, and which one is prepotent last. Okay? Let's see. All right, 1. Emotions. So that is Let's continue on with chapter 9. I'm going to rip that off. Actually, chapter 9 continued. Emotions. So if you'll notice, it's so 9 questions on motivation. I hope you can see that. 9 questions on motivation. I'll move it up a little bit. Okay, hopefully you can see. 9 questions on motivation. All right. And then emotions. 4 questions on motivation. Okay, so let's see. Purpose of motivations. Purpose of emotions, excuse me. Parts of the brain and their role in emotions. Okay. Let's see. Remember the classic theories of motivation? Actually, you know what? I'm going to be honest with you. There are 5 questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, and actually 2 parts of the brain. 2 parts of the brain and motivation. Okay. And then there's a question on Paul Ekman's work. Do you remember that one? Okay. So actually, if we go back, I'm sorry, I guess there are going to be 14 questions on chapter 9. I apologize for that. Any questions so far, folks? Go ahead and type in the chat bar. Okay, chapter 10. Okay, and this is sex and gender chapter. Go back to my whiteboard. Hopefully you can see the whiteboard. Okay, sex and gender. So I guess they're going to be, I think I've got 11 questions. 11 questions. I'm sorry. Okay, so, all right, let's see. Genes. Okay, 2 questions on genetics of sex determination. And then there's a question on the dichotomy of sex. Is it best to think of sex as a dichotomy, or is it best to think of it as a continuum? Folks, what do you think? A dichotomy or a continuum? Okay, let's see. 2 questions on sex, sex disorders. So actually, hold on. 2 questions on gene-related sex disorders. Do you remember that? We talked about Klinefelter syndrome. I talked about Turner syndrome. I talked about congenital adrenal hyperplasia and androgen insensitivity syndrome. I'm going to ask you about 2 of those. Yes, it is a continuum, correct, Jasmine and Melissa. We should think about it as a continuum. Okay, so let me see. So we got 2 questions, 1 question, 2 questions. Okay. And then there's a matching question on gender, sex, consistency. Right? Remember we talked about cisgender, transgender, genderqueer, and androgynous? Exactly. There were 4, Miriam. I'm only asking you about 2 of the gene-related sex disorders. There is a matching question on gender, sex, consistency. Okay. Okay. There's a question on gender schema. 1 question here, 1 question here. Brain and gender. There's a question on brain and gender. Being raised. Oh, excuse me. And 1 on environmental causes of gender. Right? So these are biological and environmental causes of gender. Does that make sense? Right. Tommy, I'm glad you like that. I think that's a really important concept that ought to be covered in a psychology class. I don't know if you were in the lecture that day, but I told the class that there was a time when I didn't understand what transgender was, and in learning, going to graduate school and learning about this, I think evolved myself as a human being to understand that, because I had a pretty simplistic view of sex as a young man. So I think it was good for me to use that as a teaching moment, and I think everybody should use that as a teaching moment. Glad to see you're here, by the way, Tommy. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's. Chapter 10 continued. Let's see. There's a question on factors associated with homosexuality. And there's one on changing gender role beliefs. All right, does that make sense? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 questions on sex and gender. Okay, is that cool? Any questions about chapter 10? Chapter 11, health psychology. Okay. Okay. I'm not getting any typing feedback, so I'm not sure if I need to move on yet. Should I move on? Hala? Tommy, Jasmine, Melissa, Noelia? Is it cool to move on to the next chapter? Okay, yes. I hope I'm not going too fast. Okay, cool. Do you find these review sessions to be helpful, or am I scribbling too poorly for you to get it? Hopefully this is working. Okay, health psychology. Okay, so there's a question on I want you to know let's see. Hold on. Let me go back here for just a second. Okay. Very good. Okay, good. That's the key here. There's a question on positive psychology. What is it? What do they study? There's a question on the bio-psycho-social model. Okay. What is well-being? Okay. There's a question on smoking. Remember, that's a health behavior that we're interested in. There's a matching question on body image disorders. Okay. Okay. Ooh, actually, you know what? I'm sorry. What is well-being and outcomes of well-being? There's a question on that. Let's see. There's one question on daily hassles versus major life stressors. Just like on your homework, where I ask you to tell me which of these is a daily hassle or a life stressor, I want you to do that on the exam as well. There's one question. Do stressors always lead to stress? Remember we talked about that. Okay, one. Okay. Then there's a question on emotion versus problem focused coping. If you remember on the homework, I give you a bunch of examples and ask you to tell me which one represents either emotional or problem focused coping. I do the same thing on the exam. Amy K, on the stressors, do you mean positive or negative stress or just negative? Well, that's the thing. We suggested that positive stressors, eustress, still can lead to the experience of stress. Even if it's a major life event that is positive, like the birth of a baby or getting married, that can still potentially lead to the psychological experience of stress, Amy K. But I suggested to you that the final experience of stress doesn't depend so much on the stressor, is how you respond to the stressor. No, not necessarily. Remember, Amy, we talked about the mediating factors. Anytime something stressful happens, so your wedding, or not your wedding, I don't mean to suggest you, but you as in the general person can have a stress response. Your wedding can be stressful for you, or it doesn't have to be stressful for you. It depends upon how you respond to that stressor. And we talked about those mediating factors. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yeah, the point of the question will be for you to understand that just because something is a stressor, it does not necessarily cause you to experience stress. It depends upon your personality qualities, it depends upon your coping strategies, or it depends upon your social support. Okay? Let's see. 1, 2. Okay. 2 questions on the biology of sympathetic nervous response. You remember we talked about the sympathetic nervous response. I suggested to you that there's an amygdala involved in it. The hypo, and we have the hypothalamus hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. I suggested to you that your amygdala causes the HPA axis to release two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, if you remember that. So there's two questions on the biology. There's one question on Lazarus model of stress. Do you remember that? We talked about the primary and secondary appraisals that are associated with stress. Do you remember that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There you go. That's chapter 11. 12 questions for chapter 11. Any questions on chapter 11, folks? Hopefully you don't have any questions. So I have to revise my my estimate. It's 14. What is it? What did I say? 14 questions on chapter 9, 11 questions on chapter 10, 12 questions on chapter 12, and there are going to be 12 questions on 12 questions on chapter 11, and there are going to be 12 questions on chapter 12. Nope, it's perfect. Fantastic. Okay. Do you folks like me writing on the notepad? Is that helpful to you at all? Should I continue that? I'd be curious in getting your feedback as to whether or not you think that's helpful. Okay. And so now we've got chapter 12. In chapter 12, I talked about chapter 12 today. That is, for the last couple of days, that's social psychology. Okay, good. All right, fantastic. Okay, so now we are actually at chapter 12. Let's see. I'm talking about implicit versus explicit attitudes. There's a question on, let's see, peripheral persuasion cues. Remember I asked you, I suggested to you that sometimes we think deeply about the arguments that are made when we form our attitudes. Sometimes we use peripheral persuasion cues. I want you to be able to identify the peripheral persuasion cues. Okay. There's a question about the mere exposure effect. Let's see. There's a question about cognitive dissonance. Let's see. The question about bystander apathy. There's a question about Milgram's obedience study. There's a question about in-group favoritism. One question about the fundamental attribution error. There's a question about social loafing. Oops, you know what? There's another question about a general question about the elaboration likelihood model. That's a general question. If you remember, peripheral persuasion cues are related. Both of these are ELM questions. Okay. Remember, peripheral persuasion cues are sometimes used in the elaboration likelihood model. Sometimes you think deeply about the questions about the items you're asked to be persuaded to. Okay. There's a question about what do social psychologists study? And there's a question about normative versus informational influence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 questions on chapter 12. Okay. So that's the exam in a nutshell. Does anybody have any? Well, Milgram's the shock study. Milgram's was the shock study. Very good question. And remember, Milgram showed that normal people, just like you and me, can be persuaded to do awful things upon the influence of what we believe to be a legitimate authority. Remember, his study was trying to discover whether or not these Nazi war criminals were really just following orders. Were they normal people following orders, or were they awful monsters? And what Milgram's research showed was that these Nazi war criminals might have been just average people who just happened to find themselves in a circumstance where they were under the social influence of a powerful authority. Good question, Jasmine. Good question. Does anybody have any general questions about the exam? Is there anything else I can provide for you in the way of help for this exam? Short of actually giving you the exact questions. But I'm going to be quite honest, going over this review sheet, I pretty much gave you the exact questions that I was going to be asking. So my idea was to provide you all the resources you needed so that you could get an A on this exam. Are we able to know the topics for the short answer question? Yeah, good God, Melissa. Uh-oh, I accidentally closed the dadgum exam out. Hold on just a second. Maybe that's God telling me I shouldn't give you the answer. Let me log in one more time. I am so sorry. Oh no, I'm gonna have to type in. Yeah, one of them was on. Okay, one of them. I'll tell you what. I'll give you one of them. How about that? Does that sound fair enough, Melissa? Because I only remember one of them specifically. The question was, I want you to be able to tell me what is meant by the term agency. Remember, I talked to you at the beginning of the Motivation and Emotion chapter, and I said there's one fundamental difference between humans and computers, and that is humans have agency where computers do not have a sense of agency. So one of the short answer questions, I'm going to ask you to tell me what agency is. How does that sound? Fair enough? Is that a pretty good compromise, Melissa? Right. Okay. Allah has a good question. I suggested to you that when we think about prejudice, prejudice, discrimination, and what was the other one? Prejudice, discrimination, and I think racism. You know, we talked about those negative things that sometimes people exhibit where they're unfair towards people from other groups, right? So I might treat Muslims or African Americans or homosexuals poorly. You might ask the question, why? Is Chris just a bad person? And what I wanted you to know was that actually Probably not. It's sort of built into our system. It's a function of what we call social cognition. And there are two things going on there that cause us to demonstrate these, what we would call unevolved attitudes. The first is social categorization. Social categorization means that human beings divide the world into groups that we belong to and groups that we do not belong to. I, for example, am a male. I am, for example, a Caucasian. I am, for example, an American. Okay? And you, for example, Allah, you are female, you are Arab, and you are from another country. So I have an in group, and you, Allah, are from the out group. So we organize the world into groups that we belong to and groups that we do not belong to. All right, that's the first step. And that's just a part of the cognitive system. Human beings tend to divide the world into dichotomies, things I'm a part of and things I'm not a part of. That's called social categorization. Does that make sense, Allah? Now, the second step, and this is the part that creates the prejudice and the discrimination, and that's what we call social identity theory. Now, my group information is part of my sense of self. And just like I want to feel good about my individual self, I want to feel good about my group self. So I want to feel good about Chris the individual, but I also prefer Chris the Caucasian. I also prefer Chris the American. I also prefer Chris the male, because those are a part of my social identity. Those are a part of my social identity. Now, just like I'm going to treat myself better than I would treat another individual, I'm going to treat my group better than I'm going to treat another group. Okay? Because I have to do that. In order to have high self-esteem, I've got to feel good about Chris the individual. And just in order to have good group self-esteem, I've got to treat Caucasians better than I treat other races. Just as I'm a male, I want to feel good about males. I'm going to, in a sense, treat males better than I treat females. Not because I'm a bad person, but that just goes part and parcel of me having a group part of my identity. And you know what, Allah? You probably do the same thing. If given the choice between treating someone of Arab descent and someone of Caucasian descent, you know, who are you going to choose to treat better? If you had to give a piece of candy or some food to either an Arab or a Caucasian, you're probably going to choose to give that piece of candy or that piece of food to the Arab. Not because you're a bad person, but because you yourself are an Arab. And just as you would treat yourself better than you would treat another person, you're going to treat your group better than you treat another group. So, social categorization and social identity theory say we divide the world into in-groups and out-groups, and we prefer to treat our in-group better than we treat our out-group because our in-group is part of our sense of self. Does that make sense? Okay, we are now down to 4 people, so I think I've probably bored everybody enough. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. If anybody has any questions about the exam, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Remember, the exam will be available tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., and the exam is due Sunday night by midnight. Fantastic. I'm glad it was helpful. You folks have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you either tonight at 8 p.m. or next Monday for lecture. Take care, folks.